Friends, this is truly a incredible day because I have one of my heroes and I know somebody that you've seen, you've learned from, one of the leaders in the carnivore space, one of the great teachers and inspirations for so many, not only experienced carnivores, but new carnivores who discover Dr. Chaffee, begin to learn, are inspired, and embrace this way of eating. Uh, Sometimes I've joked that carnivore doesn't make us immortal. It doesn't solve every problem and give us infinite energy. But the only exception to that rule is Dr. Chaffee, because he is so incredibly prolific, productive, helpful, active, constantly teaching people, not only in Australia, where he is, but around the world. And so I am so honored that he accepted my invitation to be interviewed and to let me ask him some questions and tell his story. So welcome, Dr. Chaffee. I can't tell you how honored I am to have you.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
a very
yeah.
flattering introduction. Really appreciate that.
It's all true. It's all true. When I told my wife that I had the opportunity to interview you, she knows I was incredibly excited. She's like, "You love Dr. Chaffee. He got you started." So I, one of the things that I talk about on my channel is a lot. And the reason I started it is the non physical benefits of carnivore, the mental health aspect, the sense of calm, the reduction in anxiety, the ability to focus so much more. To me, that is one of the absolute deepest and most powerful effects. One of the things, honestly, one of the things I loved when I first discovered your YouTube videos was the way you present in such a calm, focused, intelligent way, not seeking to create conflict or impose upon somebody else, but simply calmly saying the way this is the best way, the natural, proper human diet. So people ask me, and I give my best understanding, but what is it about the carnivore diet that has such a wonderful effect on our mental health, on reducing anxiety, giving us calm? What's happening in our body?
There can be a lot of things. The main thing is that you're eliminating out things from your body that can negatively influence your brain and your mental health. So there are toxins in plants that can negatively affect your brain. I've certainly noticed that myself when I eat different greens and other produce items. I can get very negatively affected. I can get very depressed and very unhappy and anxious, and I just you just don't feel well. And things upset me a lot more than they normally would. Now things can still upset me, but it's really a lot of things are like, okay, well, that's a problem, and okay, I just have to work on it. I just have to use it. It's much more matter of fact. I just have to deal with it. Whereas when I was eating that, things were a lot harder. It was like they brought me down. They made me miserable and depressed. And so I see that in my patient population, but we also see this in clinical trials. One of the main benefits as well is improvement of our metabolism of our neurons in the functionality of our mitochondria and our neurons in general. When our brain is running on ketones, that's actually our brain's primary energy source. People think that we need to eat sugar in order to get energy for your brain. That's actually not true. First of all, we make glucose. And so you don't ever have to eat glucose or sugar to have enough because we just make it de novo. But when you have a sufficient amount of ketones and an abundance of glucose, your brain will only run on the ketones. At least your cortex will, two-thirds of your brain will just run on ketones. Even when there's glucose available, it doesn't matter. It only runs on those ketones. That's a preference. And so that's its primary energy source. And it's only when those ketones start coming down is when you start replacing that with glucose. So that's a priority to get those ketones. And the glucose is a secondary modality. So your brain runs better. Also, your mitochondria are better able to function and
Mm.
create energy. The mitochondria actually run the inner workings of the cell. They move around internally inside the neurons and inside all of your cells, and they actually make things go. So they're going up to the surface of the cell, going up to some transport molecule, and they're giving it energy so that it can do its job, and giving energy over here so you can send this neurotransmitter and this signal to another neuron and so on. And so if those mitochondria are slowed down and they're not able to get the energy that they need, they're going to show up late and they're not going to make enough energy. So they're a day late and a dollar short. And when you're compounding that from hundreds or thousands of mitochondria in every neuron, and you have eh, upwards of 800 billion to 2 trillion neurons in your body, you're going to actually run into significant issues. Another thing is just that energy. So you'll see people actually improving quite quickly by eliminating out these acute phase reactants that can cause harm to the brain and slow down and damage the workings of the brain. And you're switching over to ketones. So the brain has its primary energy source. So it works better from that standpoint. But then you see in the longer term, over the weeks and over the months, people improving more, and people with schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, ADHD, even autism, that they start improving early on and then continue to improve later on. One of the main reasons for those late stages of improvement are when your insulin is low, you go through something called autophagy, which is autophagy. Your body's eating itself. Is taught or thought by a lot of people that you have to fast in order to do this. You have to just stop eating for 3 to 5 days. And you certainly can do that, but you don't have to. It's really insulin that blocks autophagy. So when you stop eating carbohydrates and your insulin comes down to a normal level, you go through autophagy anyway. So studies have shown that when you're on a ketogenic diet, after several months on a ketogenic diet, you have 4 times the number of mitochondria, and they're 4 times as effective because you're turning over and recycling the older mitochondria and replacing them with newer, faster, better mitochondria and more of them. You're increasing the number
Right.
of them as well. And so that's a massive improvement for the health of
Yes.
your neurons, health of your brain. And so you end up having a much more ordered brain, and your mental health improves dramatically. And we've seen this in clinical trials, reversing things like schizophrenia and major depression in people that were refractory to treatment. They were treatment resistant, and then they put them on a ketogenic diet, a high fat, animal based ketogenic diet, because that's really what a ketogenic diet is. You have to replace carbohydrates with fat and protein, and the fat and protein they replace it with are animal fats and proteins. And so that's a whole food, animal based, high fat, animal based approach. And they're finding that they have massive improvements in these treatment refractory patients, people that were just no hopers and just had to be institutionalized, or they maybe wind up on the streets or something like that. Very hard cases. And then you give them their life back and they can go back to having a normal life, which is absolutely incredible to be able to do that for someone.
Oh my God. Yeah. As a rabbi who sees people come to me for counseling, and then as a parent of two teenage girls,
Mhm.
it is the mental health issues that I encounter on a daily basis are just enormous. And I mean, they were bad before, what happened in 2020 in the illness, and they've
Mhm.
they've grown even since then. And to me, it's a travesty how nutrition exacerbates that, just what served in schools. And one of the most compelling videos you made a month or two ago, you were talking a little bit about how we got to this place. And you referenced I think it was your grandfather or great grandfather who was a doctor
Mhm.
in the 1890s. But can you talk a little bit about how did we end up in this place where carbs are just consumed in such excess quantities, and that's the norm that we're
Mhm.
not doing what our bodies were designed to do? How did we get here?
It's the reverse of the ketogenic diet, right? Is if you get rid of carbohydrates, you have to replace them with fat and protein. And you get that from meat. And we vilified meat. We said fat was bad, cholesterol was bad, and therefore meat was bad because meat contained both fat and cholesterol. And so we said, okay, get rid of meat. And then what do you replace it with? Carbohydrates and animal or and plant fats as well. So since the late 70s, when these declarations came into being, we reduced red meat by over 33%, increased fruits and vegetables by a similar amount, and over tripled the amount of sugars and high fructose corn syrup. Same thing as sugar. It's basically exactly the same chemically. And seed oils. We more than tripled our caloric intake of the vegetable oils and seed oils that we had. And what's happened? We've become the fattest and sickest that human beings have ever been in history. And so I don't think that really follows that meat is the culprit there, certainly not red meat, because we reduced red meat and everything got worse. We replaced some of that meat with chicken, so the total meat consumption is similar, but a lot of that was lean chicken breast, and you're losing a lot of calories there, and so you need to replace those calories with carbs and plant fats. So that was the main ones when they vilified meat, and that the vilification of meat goes back a long way. But when you see when you see the rise in chronic diseases, that's really a new phenomenon that they really didn't exist in any great number before the 20th century. There were chronic diseases, but some of them were different, and some of them were just very low in prevalence. We had autoimmunity and rheumatoid arthritis in the 1800s, but it wasn't anything close to what it is now. Diabetes really didn't exist, and to a great degree, type 1, which was called juvenile onset, was around, and then type 2 was up until the 90s was called adult onset diabetes. And but then all of a sudden 10-year-olds were getting adult onset diabetes and fatty liver disease, and they say, hold on, it's a kid. How can a kid get adult onset diabetes? And how is he getting fatty liver disease? Only alcoholics get fatty liver disease. He never drank anything in his life. He's 10. And so instead of thinking about it and thinking, okay, what changed in our environment? Because obviously not our genetics. They just said, probably happening all the time. We just didn't notice it. And so maybe just mistakes, false diagnosis of juvenile diabetes when they were really adult diabetes. And so they just renamed it type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This doesn't really make sense. That one shouldn't have got by the guards, because the presentation of type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes are entirely different. You have someone who is type 1 diabetic that stopped making insulin, and they just waste away until they die. You can't put on muscle or fat without insulin. It is the energy storage hormone. You can't do that really otherwise. There are some chemicals like some lectins, actually plant toxins, that can do that same thing. But as far as our normal physiology, it's insulin. And so without insulin, type 1 diabetics will waste away until they die, and unless they get insulin. And so they generally present by losing an extraordinary amount of body weight in a very short amount of time, and then go into ketoacidosis and end up in the hospital. And that's a very different case than type 2 diabetic that is overweight and metabolically sick and has no problem putting on weight. In fact, the losing weight is the least of their worries at the moment. And that one shouldn't have gotten by anybody. That was a bit of a sad fraud, but we just didn't worry. We didn't think about it. People just trusted the authorities. So it
And
all
I
comes
often
down to the
find
vilification of meat, really.
that's right. And I often find it's not the so I know you come from a family of doctors too. My dad is a doctor. My grandfather was a doctor. And sometimes in the carnivore community, we sometimes tend to demonize doctors sometimes. Not you, obviously, not other carnivore doctors, but people. And I don't think it's the doctors often. It's the system itself where doctors are often my dad was a psychiatrist and he was basically allowed to see patients for 10 minutes if they were covered by
Mhm.
certain insurance. If it was a private pay, it's a different story. But our system is set up so that you get in these patterns of diagnoses and you have to get through so many patients. You can't really dive deep into the issues. Some
Yeah.
doctors do, thank God, but I could see how that would happen with adult onset diabetes. Another topic that is people ask me about that I know is a tremendous issue and that I personally am involved in right now is cholesterol and how that became demonized as well. I think one of the ways you know you're really invested in the carnivore story and you have to have the confidence in what we're doing is when as a carnivore, even keto, your LDL goes way up, your LDL
Mhm.
cholesterol. And my last one was 354. And my doctor, my GI was just shocked. And I was very happy with it. How did cholesterol, how did this story emerge? I know there's a book called The Cholesterol Myth, but can you describe
Right.
it for us as to how we came to this current paradigm?
Yeah, it was to try to throw the scent off of processed foods and sugar, really. So the Sugar Research Foundation, now called the Sugar Association, they paid off professors from Harvard and elsewhere to paint the blame on cholesterol and to exonerate sugar. And so That's not me saying, that's them saying that. Their own internal memos were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2016, detailing how they paid off 3 Harvard professors to falsify data and publish fraudulent studies to vilify cholesterol and to exonerate sugar. And one of those professors was named head of the USDA, and he was the one who authored and published the USDA declaration saying that cholesterol caused heart disease when it was much more likely to be sugar. Because as far as I can tell, there were no serious scientists who independently came up with the idea that cholesterol caused heart disease. That was entirely an invention of the sugar companies. And then they paid and bribed different professors from Harvard and elsewhere, Ansel Keys being one of the professors from elsewhere that was on the cover of Time magazine and all these sorts of things as pushing this theory that cholesterol caused heart disease. They were paid shills. But they didn't come up with this. The sugar companies came up with this, and they paid them to say that. And this was a fraud from the beginning. There are exactly 5 randomized controlled trials on replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat and lowering LDL cholesterol and looking at what then happens as a consequence of this in relation to cardiovascular disease. They're pretty well designed, that thousands of patients, and none of them have shown an improvement by doing that. 3 of them showed that you can, yes, you can replace butter with margarine and all these other sorts of things and lower LDL cholesterol and lower total cholesterol, but they had no benefit or improvement in their cardiovascular disease or mortality rates. Then another 2 showed that it actually killed more people to do that. The best study that they had was, excuse me, was the largest one, had nearly 10,000 people. Ansel Keys was involved in that, and it was a patient population of 9,600 people that were institutionalized, so they could actually perfectly control their diet. So they didn't have people go home and just self-report that they were, yes, I'm sticking to the diet. They knew that they were sticking to the diet, which is a major thing in these sorts of studies. And so they followed them for years. They replaced out butter and animal fat with margarine and vegetable oils. And what happened? Yes, they lowered cholesterol, they lowered LDL cholesterol, and more of them died of heart attacks and strokes as a result of that. And what is that? Did that just come out? No, that was 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago now, and buried. It was buried. And so Ansel Keys knew this. So Ansel Keys knew that cholesterol was not the culprit here. And he did these studies and he showed with experimental data that this was not the issue, that this is actually worse to lower people's cholesterol, or at least to lower it by those means and to replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat. He knew that they were harming people by doing this, and yet he kept doing it and he buried the evidence. And now people are just trying to pretend that, well, because we've always done it, then obviously we should keep doing it because there must have been a good reason we started on it. No, there's a really bad reason we started on it. And anytime you start with a false premise, anything you have based on a false premise, you have to throw out. You have to throw it out and start again. And Dr. Zoe Harcum is a very interesting lady. She did a PhD in, I believe, public health out of Cambridge. And that was her doctoral thesis. And her
Mm.
doctoral research was, okay, based on the information available to the governing bodies at the time in the 1970s, should we have limited saturated fat and restricted cholesterol and gone through all these interventions based on the evidence then? And she found no, absolutely not. The evidence was completely against the cholesterol theory of heart disease. Okay, great. Things change. We get new information. What about now? Double no. It's even more clear that we should not be restricting cholesterol and saturated fat. Again, only 5 randomized controlled trials. We have one of the largest industries in the world is the cholesterol industry. Statins are the most successful drugs that have ever been put on the market. And maybe, the Ozempics and the Wegovy's and things like that will eclipse them. But, right now it's statins and they're not going anywhere, right? Because they're trying to get younger and younger people on statins, and that just makes them more money. And so there's a lot of money in this, and you would think that, okay, then we should have some really good evidence for this. We should have a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials showing that this is a good idea. And no, we have only 5. and they all show the opposite, or at least show
Right.
that it's not an improvement to lower your cholesterol. And so it's quite shocking when you learn that, and that this entire industry is propped up on the back of really weak epidemiological studies that just do not hold up to scrutiny. And there are other studies that have come out in large scale studies in the last 10 years that have looked at, okay, what about people on statins and lowering their LDL cholesterol? Do they live longer? Do they have less heart disease? In fact, they found no, they don't. And one study with, it was around 60,000 patients over the age of 65, which is the general patient population that you're going to have on a statin. Now they're trying to get younger and younger, but generally it was people of that age group, and that's who you're trying to prevent having heart attacks. The most common age for having heart attacks is over 65. And so on a statin, they said, okay, does this prolong life? Does this reduce your heart attacks? And they found out no, actually, it's either neutral or slightly worse. And it's okay, maybe we need to really rethink this whole thing. And so that argument's been made. The Journal of the American College of Cardiology, one of the premier journals for cardiology, they published a landmark paper in 2020 that looked at all the randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses, all the top shelf levels of evidence for saturated fat and its connection with cardiovascular disease. And they found absolutely no association whatsoever between increased saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. None. And in fact, they found a protective mechanism between increased levels of saturated fat intake and stroke. So that the higher saturated fat people ate, the less strokes they had. The less saturated fat they ate, the more strokes they had. And so the idea that we should be limiting saturated fat and restricting this from people is not in keeping with the evidence.
Yeah, that's you just summarized it so well. This is one of the reasons I began my channel is the moral imperative of it. I think this is an issue of people's health, people's the way people connect with one another, surviving. When Judaism, whenever we are in a moment of joy, we say l'chaim, to life. And that to me, this is about enhancing our life, adding life to our years. And that's a moral imperative. We do so much for our health. And to ignore this way of eating and everything that has gone into creating this paradigm is it's mind-boggling. I mean, it shows the way certain conceptions can take hold and they're very difficult to break. And I think that's we know it's broken, but we don't quite know what to do to fix it. We know what to do, but to spread word is so difficult. As somebody who sees patients, you not only obviously do research but and know the research, but somebody who sees patients, what are the biggest challenges? What do you find is most difficult for people in embracing this way of eating?
A big one is the cholesterol because that's been so drilled into our head. That's something that we have to do. That's usually pretty surmountable. But some of the biggest deal is it's just such a departure from what they've been doing their whole life. They think, I don't know how I'm going to do that. I don't know how that works. Once you show them and discuss with them the benefits of this and why it makes sense and why it matters and why it's important, and you talk to them, I have a bit of an advantage because when I'm seeing them in that context and I do a very deep dive into their blood work, do a deep dive into their history, talking about all their health issues and problems. And then I can actually tell them based on different studies or my experience, what they can expect with these dietary changes. Look, going through their blood panel and saying, look, this is a direct result of eating this way. Your fasting insulin should never be above 7, 8, or 9. Really, it should never really be above 9. Absolutely. And you have people that are fasting insulin are 35. One guy was 72. 72 was his fasting insulin. And so when he's not fasting, that's going to be much higher than that. Again, insulin affects over 100 different mechanisms in your body. If it's around a 5, which is a good number for your fasting insulin to be, it's affecting everything at a 5. And that's everything's in balance. When you eat pasta, it jumps up to 35. It's affecting everything at a 35, right? So that's a problem. Now your fasting insulin's at 72. That's not going to be
Yeah.
good for you. And so you talk about that and you show the other hormones and how they're being affected by it. It's going to lower women's estrogen. It's going to put them into early menopause and give them polycystic ovarian syndrome. Lower men's testosterone, lower everyone's growth hormone. which is the hormone of youth. It helps rebuild and repair our tissues so that we stay younger for longer. And when you are eating carbohydrates, that raises insulin, blocks the action of growth hormone. And so you age faster. So that's not what you want. And you can show these numbers in real definite term and many more that go into that as well. And you can discuss the mechanisms of actions, the physiology behind that. And you can talk about their health issues. And look, these all add up together that you need to change your diet in these ways. And I have a motivated patient population because I'm
Right.
not just getting people off the street. They're coming to me because they've heard that I can help people and that they know people that have gotten good results. There's a lot of word of mouth advertising that goes around and we talk about it and so a lot of people are like, okay, that makes sense. I'll give it a try. And I give them some resources, things to read and things to watch in that regard. But that's a big one. It's just a big lifestyle change. But a lot of them are very motivated in order and want to try something and they come because the medical establishment hasn't worked, it hasn't worked out for them, is great for acute care. It's brilliant for surgeries and acute management. But the chronic disease side of things, we have really not, we've just laid an egg on this one. And so we have to do something else. And patients see that and they're like, okay, I don't feel well. I don't feel good. I'm just getting on more and more medications. My blood pressure is just getting worse. My diabetes is just getting worse. My testosterone is getting worse. Everything's getting worse. My weight's getting worse. I'm doing everything that I'm being told and nothing's working. It's okay. Let's try something else. I've tried everything so far. So might as well try this. And then it works. And then I'd say
Right.
these things will change in these ways if you change your diet in this fashion, that's it in your health. And then that's exactly
Yep.
what happens. And they just say, sold. That's fine with me.
Right.
But yeah,
You have a motivated population.
yep.
What you tell them works. This is, to me, one of the big issues, and this isn't just in healthcare. This is in finance and investments and relationships. So much. Who do you trust? That is,
Mm,
who do you trust? And that can be confusing for people. Just the average person, if they're getting studies saying cholesterol is horrible, and then they're in saturated fat is horrible, and then they're hearing other messages, saturated fat is good for you and cholesterol isn't bad, it can be confusing. But when they
right.
have that one-on-one relationship, that makes a huge difference. And people trust doctors. And this
Mm,
to me is a meta issue. I- Obviously, if more doctors became, we need 10,000 Dr. Chaffees, but if
mm.
more doctors became knowledgeable and conversant in what keto and carnivore can do for our bodies, there would be such a great sea change in health. How have you found your interactions with other doctors? Do these issues comes up? Have you seen people kind of change their thinking? What's that experience been?
It's been very positive for the most part. The doctors that I speak to about it, they're genuinely interested and they have the same questions. What about cholesterol? And what about fiber? And what about the nutrients? Are you missing anything? Can you just do this? What about the environment? And what about sustainability? All these sorts of things. It's the same
Yeah.
questions. They're all legitimate questions, but they all have legitimate answers. And because most doctors, not all of them, but most doctors actually came into the profession because they wanted to help people. They like the idea of being able to fix people and cure disease and do good things for their fellow man. That they look at that and go, "Oh, that's interesting," and they're interested and they're evidence driven by and large. And so they hear that and they go, "Oh, okay, but what about this? What about this?" And you lay out the arguments and you show them the studies and the data and the evidence for that, and they say, "That sounds great." And so a
Mm.
lot of people have become very interested in it. Now, maybe they don't necessarily do it themselves or incorporate it into their practice, but a lot of them do. And I've had a lot of colleagues and friends of mine that have become very interested in this, have done it themselves, have found that it improved their health. They started looking into it more and they started applying it to their patient population with extraordinarily good results. And so it's something that
The pudding.
well, there it is. Yeah. I mean, you just, it doesn't matter what a study says. It doesn't matter what I say or anybody else says. All these points of information and studies, all they can do is help guide you and make a decision. And then you make a decision and say, okay, I'm going to give it a try and see if it does help my Crohn's disease. And then you do it and it does. That's what matters. And someone says, well, no, it's not going to. Here's this study that says it won't, but you do it and it does. That's all that matters. That's the only thing
Yeah.
that matters. And so a lot of people are doing that now. And they're saying, okay, I'm on board. I'm semi convinced. I'm willing to give it a try anyway and see what happens. And then they get the positive results. They say, okay, I guess they're right. And they go from there. And so a lot of doctors are coming to this. Though I, I normally work in neurosurgery as well as a private practice in metabolic medicine. The reason I work in this metabolic medicine practice is because the practitioner that was there, we just met through friends and we got to talking about this, and he used a lot of diet and lifestyle interventions in his practice. And then so he was very interested in my thoughts and research into the carnivore diet and just started picking my brain and asking me about all these sorts of things. I started sending in resources and studies, and he thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then he just did my bloods. He just said, okay, you look great. You look like you're fit. Let's check under the hood. Would you be interested in doing that? I was like, sure. It's academic. I'm putting in my body what's designed to go in my body. And so whatever happens on the other side of that is supposed to happen. So I never really worried about my blood work because I felt great and
Right.
I trusted the physiology. I'm putting in the right inputs, and so my bloods are going to do what they're supposed to do. And that's exactly what happened. So it is nice to prove that. But when we checked my blood work, we did a very deep dive into my blood panel, my hormones and all these and nutrients and vitamins and things like that. And he said that if you took 100,000 people my age off the street, that my test would be number one without a shadow of a doubt. And so he said, okay, I'm really interested now. Let's talk more about this carnivore diet over a steak sometime.
Right.
And then he is much more meat based now. He eats a lot more
Right.
meat. He eats predominantly meat. He still has some other things, but he dips on and off, full carnivore or not. And but that's what I see a lot of people around. They eat a lot more meat. Maybe they don't, maybe they go full carnivore for a while. Maybe they stick with it. A lot of people have, or maybe they just eat a lot more meat and a lot less of the other stuff. Either way, they're improving their health in the right direction. And he saw the benefits in my blood work and the benefits in himself. And then he started suggesting it to his patients
Mhm.
and it worked. And he had these absolutely incredible results, reversing autoimmunity, reversing diabetes, reversing major illnesses, and getting people to lose weight and gain health. And so he wanted me to work there as well in order to take on that role and help people in that way. I started doing that because he retired. He's in his late 70s and just was like, yeah, I want to go home. So he's now the medical director there, but I'm the main practitioner there. So that's why I took that over, was because he was very interested in me taking over his patient population because he could see just how beneficial this was for them.
That's the most incredible proof. Do you one of it, for somebody who's just getting started, who
Mhm,
just wants to learn, who's ready to take the first step, maybe they don't even have, maybe it's not out of desperation, maybe it's more out of optimization, but they don't feel 100%. They know something's wrong.
mhm,
What do you point them to? How do they get started? There's no introduction to carnivore book. Maybe you got to
mhm.
write that. But what do you refer to people who just want to get started to change their paradigm?
So I generally have a few videos that I've made on the subject that I think are really good introductions to the ideas behind a carnivore diet. Dr.
Great.
Baker has written a book, The Carnivore Diet,
Great.
and he talks about that. And there are a couple of these things out there. There are even older ones. Go back to the 1800s. Dr. J.H. Salisbury, who was a New York doctor in the 1800s, he did a 30-year research project into the optimal nutrition for human beings. And he studied this very closely and did experimental trials with different sorts of foods. And he found that people that were eating more plants were getting diseases other people simply weren't. And then he found that he could cure them by putting them on a pure red meat and water diet. And that's what Salisbury steak is. It's just
Yeah.
a hamburger patty ground up in a way that it filters out the connective tissue and gristle.
Right.
And so that's very digestible. And you absorb nearly 100% of that and have almost no waste after that. So if you have bad Crohn's disease or bad intestinal diseases, then it just settles it right down because you're just completely resting the bowel. And so we wrote a book on that called The Relation of Alimentation and Disease. So the relationship between what we eat and the diseases we get, which is actually exactly the book I'm writing right now, except in the modern era, making this argument that we're having this ramp up in diseases, that these are not diseases, that this is from eating an inappropriate diet. And I try
Yes.
to make that argument that Salisbury made 120 years ago or more. And other people
Right.
made it too. Dr. Walter Vogelin made that argument in 1975. He wrote a book called The Stone Age Diet. And he said,
Yep.
look, humans are carnivores. Here's the evidence for that. And this is how it applies to medicine. And he was a gastroenterologist. He basically argued, if you don't eat plants, my specialty doesn't need to exist. And so there are a number of these things out there. And then it just got completely papered over by the McGovern report and the USDA declaring that cholesterol causes heart disease, meat's bad and evil. And we just said, yeah, screw all the medical knowledge we've had for the last 150 years. We're just going to run on and eat plants. And then we've gotten fatter and sicker than we've ever been in human history. So there's a couple of videos that I have on this one called Facts About Carnivore and Vegan Diets. That sort of lays out
Good.
most of the arguments involved here on why meat's good, why the plants you don't want to eat, and countering a lot of the vegan arguments about why we shouldn't eat meat. And then one just called Why We Are Carnivores, just going through the evidence and evidence for that and why it matters. And then there's
That's right.
one that got a lot of notoriety called Plants Are Trying to Kill You. And it's
Of
about
course.
plant toxins and why it's not only good to eat meat, you really want to avoid the plants because they can be very harmful to you. And a few others, but those are the main ones I try to point people towards. And I have a playlist called Getting Started on a Carnivore Diet. I curated
Good.
some videos there. And so that's what I usually point them to. I usually point my patients in that direction. Oh, and then I do a video called The Truth About Cholesterol and Heart Disease, showing the evidence for why this was a fraud and how this is not actually harmful to us. And actually, it's very important. All our hormones are made out of cholesterol. Our brain's made out of cholesterol. Our body's made out of cholesterol. Every cell in our body is cholesterol. The lipid bilayer of our cell membranes
Yes.
is cholesterol. And so this is a very important
Yes.
molecule that we need to have and we make in abundance. So the idea that we're just making poison continually and then using that poison for normal things is a bit absurd. And so you're not going to physiologically, in normal circumstances, make something harmful to you. You can get blood sugar that's too high, and that can be harmful to you, but you're not going to do that in a physiologically normal state. In fact, your body keeps it under very tight control, just like it keeps your blood pH under tight control. Because if that goes too high or too low, that's bad. And so we keep our LDL and cholesterol in tight control. We keep that exactly where our body wants it. And it starts getting
That's right.
out of balance because of something we're doing to manipulate it. That's probably going to cause us harm. And when you fast, when you just stop eating and let your body go back to a physiological reset, what happens? LDL goes up, total cholesterol goes up, HDL goes up, triglycerides go down. That's the exact same thing that happens when you go on a carnivore diet.
Yes.
Exactly the same thing. And so it's much more likely that's our physiological set point, and that's where we're supposed to be. And we're not actually slamming up our cholesterol because we're eating fat and cholesterol. It's because our body's supposed to be there. It's actually it's not because we're eating fat and meat. It's because we're not eating carbohydrates.
That's
Because
right.
if you just stop eating carbohydrates and you don't eat fatty meat, LDL still shoots up. It's a physiological state. It's not because of the fat or the meat. I just point them in that direction, and then I have a couple of videos on how to get
Perfect.
started on a carnivore diet. One's just called Carnivore for Beginners and fiber constipation and diets, those sorts of things, frequently asked questions. I actually made the YouTube channel in order to have a place to direct patients because I found that I was just talking to them for so long that it was just like, I was like, I like being able to talk to a patient for 2 hours, but I can't do that.
Right.
And sometimes it was
Thank God
important.
you made it.
Yeah.
Thank God you made it. There are tens of thousands of people. I want to respect your time, and I know,
Mm,
but I want to ask one thing that I struggle with understanding, and I hope maybe you can summarize some of the research here. What is some of the current thinking by people like Dr. Thomas Seyfried and others who are looking at cancer and the way carnivore keto diet can help treat, address, prevent? I don't quite
mhm.
understand his point of view in all the research that's going on. Can you summarize that for me?
Yeah. Yeah, basically it comes down to the fact that or the idea and the proposal that cancer is not a genetic disorder, that it is a mitochondrial disorder, disorder of the mitochondria, and that it so it's completely different etiology. It's a completely different cause of the cancer, and therefore it's going to have a completely different treatment. So if you're trying to treat a genetic condition, you're going to have different treatment modalities than if you're treating metabolic mitochondrial disease. So the reason for that is it actually came from Dr. Otto Warburg, who's a Nobel Prize
Otto
winner in
Warburg.
physiology a century ago. He actually got the Nobel Prize around a century ago. And he did decades of research on cancer, well past his Nobel Prize. He got that earlier on. And so he actually theorized and showed in his experiments that you can't get cancer if you have healthy mitochondria. Cannot. So that those are the prevention side of things. Keep keep your mitochondria nice and healthy. There's all these carcinogens in the world. They all damage the mitochondria. There's plant toxins that are carcinogenic. They damage your mitochondria. Cyanide, it's in a lot of different plants, and that directly damages your mitochondria. And now, for some damn reason, people are taking in cyanide containing apricots, pits, or something like that. And they're saying, oh, this is going to help cancer or something like that. They don't even have cancer. They're just trying to take cyanide to weed this stuff out. That's reckless to me because the cyanide damages the mitochondria. This cancers already have damaged mitochondria. They're already completely destroyed. That's not going to do anything to them. It's only going to damage you. And so that's completely reckless. So Warburg said that this was from damaged mitochondria. And so the mitochondria can't police the cell once they're too far gone. The mitochondria are what run the cell, like I said, with your neurons and everything else. So when the cell wants to divide, it actually if it's something's wrong and something's not going quite right, the mitochondria will say, "No, this isn't happening. We're stopping it right here until it gets fixed." And they stop that process from happening. But it's an active process. They have to actually physically stop it. It's not, oh, it just stops here until you hit the OK button. They have to go and stop it, right? So it requires healthy mitochondria. And if you have damaged mitochondria and they're just dysfunctional and just floating around little dead ghost ships inside your cells, they can't stop it. And the cells just divide out of control and you get unregulated cell growth and division. And that's a hallmark of cancer. That's what cancer is. It's just unregulated cell growth. And then if a cell is too damaged and it needs to be shut down through apoptosis, where the cell kills itself and programs self death, and just, nope, this has to go away now. It's the mitochondria that action that kill switch. So they send the signal out saying, no, no, this is too far gone. We got to go now. It's the mitochondria that then do something about it. So you can have pro-cancer oncogenes and things like that. You have your P53 that gets damaged. That's a little policeman that sort of stops these things. But you have all these signals that say, okay, something's damaged. We need to kill ourselves. But one of
Right.
the hallmarks of cancer is it can't kill itself. Why is
Right.
that? Maybe it could be because it's not sending the signal. But even if it is sending the signal, if it has damaged mitochondria, the mitochondria are the one that do the job. And so they can't actually action that. So when you have damaged mitochondria, you get complete dysregulation of the cells. And so Warburg said again that if you have healthy mitochondria, you cannot get cancer. And so he demonstrated these principles and different sort of experiments that he ran. He wrote a very landmark paper, or it was a landmark paper back in the 1950s, I believe 1951, just called The Origins of Cancer. And he just showed this. And then Watson and Crick came out with the double helix of DNA, and they just said, nope, everything's DNA. That's all it is, which is, it's unfortunate that we lost sight of this in the 50s because we had the answer right there. But Professor Siegfried from Boston College, very bright guy, did his postdoc at Yale and has been a full professor for quite some time, teaches cancer biology. And he said, look, when you understand the biology of cancer, you understand that this is a metabolic mitochondrial disease, and the treatments that we're using now make no sense. And so we're treating this in the wrong way. And so there are hundreds of studies in humans and animals showing that putting people on a ketogenic diet for cancer is called ketogenic metabolic therapy, and lowering the blood sugar. That actually can significantly help treat cancer. One of the things called the Warburg effect, which is that he showed, which is that cancer cells, because of their damaged mitochondria, because they have to go through a different kind of energy production called substrate level fermentation, they can't go through oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria. That these cancer cells require 400 times the amount of glucose as normal cells. And when you're eating bread and carbs and things like that, you jack up your blood sugar, and then that that gets taken in by those cancer cells. This is how we actually look for metastases in radiology. We look for PET CTs. How do we do that? We see this, oh, that's a spot. And we see all these cancers all over the body. But how do we see that? Why does it light up? Because we give them an injection of radio labeled glucose and we see where that glucose goes. It's not just dispersed
Mm,
throughout the body
mm.
and this is just taking some up. It just sucks all that in and takes that out of the bloodstream. Every time you have a sandwich or some bread or some crackers, think about that PET scan and all that those cancer cells sucking up all that glucose because that is what you're doing. So Siegfried actually showed this in experimental research that if you have healthy mitochondria, you can't get cancer. First of all, there are cancers that have no genetic changes whatsoever, none. And other cancers have cells that behave as cancer or in the big tumor body. Some of them have cancerous DNA, these genetic changes that we associate with cancer, and others don't. Some are completely normal. And like I said, some entire cancers have no genetic changes whatsoever, but they all have damaged mitochondria. All known cancers have damaged mitochondria. We can see this on electron microscope. They're just gutted. And it was in 1975, there was a detractor of Warburg's that said, "Ah, it was a nice theory, but it would rely on, it would require that, um, that these mitochondria were damaged." And now we just know now that they're not. And that's what everyone refers back to. But now we have electron microscopes. We're like, no, they're gutted. They can't do anything. They're not functional. And so now we know that he was right. Siegfried took it one step further and he took the nuclei of cancer cells with those genetic changes and transferred those, called the nuclear transfer studies. He took those and transferred those into normal cells with normal cytoplasm and mitochondria, and they did not behave as cancer, even though they had all the genetic changes for cancer. Uh, they did not behave as cancer, and you could even clone them. They cloned them into rats and frogs, right? Then he took the mitochondria out of the cancer cells. I put those into normal cells with normal DNA, normal nuclei, and they did behave as cancer. Couldn't clone them, they just died. And then just to put the nail in the coffin, he took healthy mitochondria out of normal cells and put those into cancer cells and it suppressed the cancers. Because again,
Amazing.
if you have healthy mitochondria, you cannot get cancer. The cells cannot behave as cancer because the mitochondria are what's running it. So yes, you have this DNA and that's really important. That's where all the information is. But that's like the blueprints at a in a skyscraper, a company that's building a skyscraper, right? And so if aliens are looking down, they look at people building a skyscraper, they look at these blueprints in the middle, and they have all these people coming in and congregating around and looking and then going off and doing their jobs and coming back and looking and going off. They're like, oh, those little pieces of paper, that's running the show. That's the brains of the operation because everything is coded and dictated off of those little plans, and they're very important. But they're just the plans. They're just blueprints. The mitochondria are what action the plans. Just like the construction workers and the general manager and the architect are the ones that action the plans from the blueprints. So that's the same thing with the DNA. The DNA is information. It's also a living, breathing thing. It moves around and it generates proteins based on its own sort of chemical interactions with itself, which is actually really interesting. But the mitochondria are what are going around actually actioning out the the actual running of the cell. And so when they get damaged, they can't do that, and the cell gets dysregulated and goes into cancer. So that's really the main thing. So if you have cancer,
Amazing.
you want to significantly limit the amount of energy going to those cells. You want to get away from carbohydrate, from exogenous carbohydrates, from dietary carbohydrates, and you want to, and to prevent cancer, you want to have as healthy mitochondria as possible. So you avoid things like smoking and drinking and drugs. And there's certain genetic conditions that Tay Sachs and things like that, that predispose people to getting cancer, but those damage the mitochondria as well. But that's, you can't change your genetics. You
Right.
just have to optimize your risk factors apart from that. So you just need to be a bit more careful on things. And if you're on our proper human diet, that's going to be low carb or no carb, and you're going to have much healthier mitochondria, and you're going to be able to replace out when you have these damaged mitochondria, they're not working as well. Your body's going to replace them and swap them out for newer ones. So you're never going to let them get as damaged as they would need to be in order to precipitate cancer. And that's pretty much it. If you're on any sort of ketogenic diet, like a carnivore diet, which I do believe is our primary metabolic or primary food source. And when you see animals on their primary food source, they don't get cancer. You don't see cancer in animals in the wild. You don't see cancer in zoo animals that are being fed their natural diet. You can see cancers in zoo animals that are not fed their natural diet, or in dogs and cats that are not fed their natural diet. The only animals besides humans that get cancer really are pets in captivity or animals in captivity that are not fed their traditional diet. And that is it. So it's very
It's
rare. And
amazing.
these diseases are very rare. And all these chronic diseases, dogs and cats and zoo animals get as well if they're fed something they're not supposed to. Any animal will get sick with the exact same, with lupus, with cancer, with diabetes, if they're fed what they're not designed to eat. And that goes for us as well as everything else.
That's so powerful because genetics, of course, play a role, but
Mm.
there's so much we can do that's in our control to address
Mm.
this. And this gives people hope. To me, that is what's so powerful about the carnivore diet. And it gives us hope. People face so many issues, mental health issues, physical health issues. And here is something that we can do. It's our responsibility. We have that agency. And Dr. Chaffee, you've given so many people hope. You've given so many people knowledge. I can't tell you what a privilege it is. I know I'm doing a lot of flattery, but it's honest. It is tremendously, I'm tremendously grateful to you, as I know my audience is, and so many people who continue to watch your videos and look forward to reading your book and support your Patreon. And thank you for your time. Thank you for all of your teaching and your leadership. And may this continue to grow and give people hope and change lives. Thank you.
It's quite humbling to hear these sorts of things. It's very nice when I hear these amazing recoveries that people have gotten from making these simple dietary changes, but it is so powerful, and it's something that we need to stop thinking about as just a diet. It's a medical intervention. And where this is to treat medical issues and to improve health. And I'm just really glad that more people are coming to learn about this so that they can do that for themselves.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.